And here we go with the chemical building blocks of life. And moving right along. So molecules are the building blocks of life. I'm going to read the rest of the PowerPoint slide and then explain. Carbon is the framework of biological molecules. And carbon is able to form 4 bonds in various combinations with other atoms. All life can be seen as carbon-based units because individual carbon atoms can form multiple covalent bonds. Biological molecules can be quite complex. Sorry about the typo. Now, this is a picture. And again, I'm not going to ask you questions about pentane or glyceraldehyde. But for some reason, life on Earth is carbon-based. Why, I don't know, but it is. In fact, it is so important to understand how carbon, since all of our bodies are based in carbon, we devote an entire year. You take an entire year of organic chemistry, which is all about the carbon atom. That's how important it is to life. And I'm going to leave it to the organic chemists to get into the chemical properties of carbon, but everything in our body is based on interacting with carbon molecules. You certainly can make other molecules and blah, 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 but those molecules, I would say maybe about 90% of the body is based in carbon molecules of various and sundry sizes and shapes and interactions with other atoms, blah, blah. So like you can see the pentane, the carbon is bound to hydrogen and glyceraldehyde. You've got it also being able to bind to OH or to bind to O. This is just to give you an example of how versatile this little carbon atom is. Okay, polymer is going to be another concept. We're made of carbon. We also do a lot of polymer making or polymer synthesis. I like to think about Legos as an example of this. Um, all of our complex molecules in cells, outside of cells, um, are either in a monomer form, that's going to be the individual Lego blocks, or they're going to be bound together through bonding, and that will form a polymer. Another analogy is beads on a chain. The beads are the monomer. You put the beads together on a chain to form a necklace. That's a polymer. And it's important because the way we store molecules, the way we make molecules, the way we build molecules are based on this polymer structure. And again, I'm not concerned about the names of the bonds between the molecules. I'm going to leave that up to chemistry. But when we start talking about carbohydrates and fats and nucleic acids and proteins, we're going to be talking about monomers, which are the individual beads. And then polymer is how they make up a necklace. Okay, so that brings us to us. We are made up of 4 fundamental organic molecules, and they are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, and all can exist as monomers or polymers. Again, I'm not going to test you on how they become polymers. I'm not going to test you on the molecular structures. I'm going to try to, in a very brief way, go into what they have in common, how they are different, how they work in the body. So having said that, and this is showing for, see, we have carbohydrates. The polymer is a polysaccharide, a monomer is a monosaccharide like glucose. We have lipids, fats. The polymer is the fat. The monomer is glycerol and fatty acid. We have proteins like digestive enzymes, and proteins are a polymer, and an amino acid is a monomer, and nucleic acids like DNA or RNA, they're the polymer, and the monomer is the nucleotide. This I do want you to know, and we'll get into more detail as the slides go by. So let's do carbohydrates first. Again, I'll read the PowerPoint and then explain. Carbohydrates store energy. Glycogen, again, sorry about the typo, can provide instant energy like glucose, and building materials like cellulose, which you can find in celery. Carbohydrates include monosaccharides, disaccharides, polysaccharides. What do you need to know? Monosaccharides, simple sugar as glucose. And I'm just going to have you do glucose. That's the only example of a monosaccharide or a monomer that I want you to know. And then when you start to polymerize glucose, you can polymerize it into a high energy molecule called glycogen, Glycogen, and the glycogen can be stored in skeletal muscle, can be stored in the liver to be used on a rainy day. So this is just showing you the structure of glucose, for example, and how you can have it come together to form larger units by forming a polymer. Again, this will not be on the exam. So now before we get into lipids, again, to just to reiterate that carbohydrates are a carbon-based molecule. They are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. A monomer that you need to know is glucose, and a polymer, which is a number of glucose, like beads in a necklace, form glycogen for storage. And that can be stored in the liver, and that can be stored in the skeletal muscle. Now, lipids are also only carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but they're huge. You get so much more energy, more calories when you're talking about fat and lipid. So lipids can make membranes. We'll have a whole chapter on that. Hormones, again, a whole chapter. And it's able to store energy. I mean, that is what fat cells, adipose cells, are all about, storing all that fat in those lovely little fat cells. I'll talk about phospholipids in about probably next week. So I'm not going to talk too much about it. We all know that lipid is not soluble in water. That's the reason why the oil and the, let's say, Italian spices and Italian salad dressing, you can see where the water and you can see where the oil is, and you have to mix them up together in order to get an emulsion to put on your salad. So the part that's insoluble is the lipid part, the fat part of the salad dressing. We also have cholesterol. Again, I like to talk about cholesterol. It's a humongous fat molecule, and it is the basis for most of the sex hormones. And so when we talk about that, then we will also talk about cholesterol. And fats are very efficient energy storage molecules. So when you look at a lipid or a fat, again, I'm not going to test you on that, but just look at how huge that molecule is. This is a triglyceride. And it's kind of amazing that the glycerol and the fatty acids are the monomers, and they're different. Glycerol looks like this, and fatty acids look like that. But when you put the monomer of glucose, the monomer of glycerol and the monomer of fatty acids together, you can get a huge molecule called a fat. Believe it or not, the monomers of fats can be used for energy, just like glucose. But our bodies don't do that unless they're pushed under conditions of dieting or starvation. That has to do with the fact that fat is considered to be liquid gold. You can store fat. People who are overweight can tell you exactly where their fat is located in the body. And that is for storage. So when you polymerize fat into what we would call lipid or fat, whether it be butter or it be part of a cell membrane, that's the polymer. And the polymer when you think about fat and fat cells, they're there for storage. So that if you hit upon hard times and you can't get food, as long as you're hydrated, you can quite literally eat yourself. You eat the polymerized fat, break it down into fatty acids and glycerol, which can, especially via the liver, be broken down into very usable energy. But the body doesn't want to use its liquid gold all the time. It would rather store it, and then when things become difficult, then it will break it down. So, like carbos, all the time, we use carbos for energy. So we eat food, gets broken down into glucose, and we can use that as instant energy. We store any excess in the form of glycogen, but lipid, it's different. Lipid, when you eat it and you break it down into your fatty acids and glycerol, if you're an athlete and you're running, then absolutely you can use that as energy. What happens to most of us is that it's excess calories and it's going to be stored as fat. And once it's stored as fat, it is not going to be tapped into very readily. Um, so that's kind of a survival thing. Glucose, glycogen, very easy to break down, use it as instant energy, store it as glycogen, break down really quickly, but not so much fat. And it might be the bane of my existence, but on the other hand, it's used very judiciously until you really need the calories. So that's a big difference, even though structurally it's still carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Moving right along, I am not going to cover this slide. Membrane phospholipids are going to be in a totally different lecture. So I'm going to skip this slide. And I'm obviously going to skip this slide. And I'm skipping that slide. There we go. So that was easy. On to proteins. Proteins have nothing to do with energy. Proteins are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And the big thing about amino acids and proteins is they are there for structure. They are there for three-dimensionality. Honest to God, if you didn't have proteins, you would be like a sheet of paper. But you're not. You're a three-dimensional being, and that's all due to proteins. They can do origami really well. I'll show you how they can do it in a sec. And by doing that, you've got three dimensions. So, therefore, building things in the body, structures like your skeleton, structures like your muscles, structures like your heart, bone, blah, blah. So amino acids are the monomers of proteins, and proteins are the polymers. So an amino acid is a monomer, binds together to form proteins. They're used for structures, hair, enzymes, again, skeletal muscle. There are 20 different types of amino acids. We're not getting into the different 20 until we get into DNA and RNA and protein synthesis. So right now, just to know that we have 20 different types of amino acids. One of the things they have in common is the presence of a nitrogen. That's going to be important because that's going to mean that proteins, that's how they're different than glucose. That's how they're different than a fat. And an adjacent amino acid are joined by peptide bonds. All right, so proteins, if you polymerize those amino acids, you can get a three-dimensional protein. Now, the thing with the origami, and because proteins are three-dimensional, what they do is cross-link. And this cross-linking is shown here. Again, don't memorize this. But here's a kind of a linear amino acid chain. There's nothing too 3D about it. But if you notice, these then can start to form these helices. And these cross-links are what happens because of nitrogen. Right now, I just want you to see about the nitrogen and how important that nitrogen is to making these cross links. When you start to cross link a linear molecule, you can develop a three-dimensional molecule. This is another one. Again, don't memorize this, but if you notice, you've got these bonds, and now you've got kind of like a pleated sheet. And that's 3 dimensions. A helix is 3 dimensions. Your nose is 3 dimensions. Your hair is 3 dimensions. And nitrogen allows that cross-linking. And that's a really important thing. If you want to build something, you want something to have a shape, you want it to have a size, you want to have a structure, that's protein. And then last but not least, nucleic acids. Nucleic acids, they have a monomer called a nucleotide, and they have a polymer, which the most famous is DNA, the double helix. Nucleic acids have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and now we're going to add a phosphorus, a phosphate. So they are composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphate. And so they're nucleic acids are the polymers, the monomers are nucleotides. The most important is DNA and RNA. We are going to have a whole unit on DNA and RNA. So as much as I'm going to show you a picture of it, it's going to be the ATP that I'm going to talk about in a second that I want you to know. So I'll show you a structure of DNA, so your structure of RNA. It'll be nice to kind of see where the phosphate and the nitrogens are. Not going to test you on it, but because the monomer of ATP is so important for energy in the cell, and I don't have a whole unit on it, we're going to talk about it within the conversation about nucleotides. So nucleotides have a phosphate, a sugar, which is carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen, and a nitrogen, a nitrogenous base. Okay, so I am not going to talk about this because this is about DNA and RNA. We can skip this slide. This is just showing you the structures. What do I want you to just look at? Because it's not going to be on an exam. See all the nitrogens. Over here, over here, over here, over here, over here. And then you have a phosphate, bump, 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 and bump. And then the sugar is going to be the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Nothing else do I want you to know. Now, what I do want you to know is about ATP. I'll talk about NAD later on, but ATP is a monomer of a nucleic acid. It is your energy currency of the cell. It's just like dollar bills. When you make ATP, some people call it a rechargeable battery, but it can store energy, like money in the bank. So if you want to buy something, you go to the bank and you take money out, and then you can pay for services, you can pay for an item, blah, 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 blah. So in the cell, that's the same thing. We use money in the same way that the cell uses ATP. ATP is equivalent to money in the bank. And then if I want to take that energy money out of the bank, I will split that high energy bond and use it for work. So let's get to ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the energy currency of the cell, because that's what I want you to know under as an example of nucleotides. And let's go to this next one. Okay, so as you can tell, you've got yourself a whole bunch of nitrogens and a sugar, but let's look at the phosphates. Adenosine triphosphate, 1, 2, 3, three of them. You're going to tuck away energy that can be released from a chemical reaction in the bond between the second and the third phosphate. And in that stable state, you can store energy, because what ATP wants to do is you want to be able to use it for every job in the cell that demands an input of energy. So just like dollar bills, American currencies, that they're the equivalent of the ATP when you put it in the bank. When you take it out of the bank, then you can use it to buy things. You can use it to make things. And that is the magic of ATP. So DNA, we're going to do it. You can skip this slide, but here's your lovely little double helix of DNA. Um, again, you can see the phosphate, and you can see the sugar, and you can see the nitrogenous bases. And here I think, okay, that's the end. Yay! So that's the end of the chapter. And now, once you've done all of that and you've listened to the two lectures and you've looked at the PowerPoints, you can now do the open book quiz. It's 10 questions, true, false, multiple choice. You can have all your notes. Please have all your notes in front of you. Get yourself organized. Everything that is in those 10 multiple choice true, false questions were covered in these two lectures. And if I say skip things, then they're obviously not going to be on the quiz. But take your time. The quiz is 10 questions. You're given 20 minutes. You have to do it in the 20 minutes and have everything out in front of you so that you can look at your notes, look at the PowerPoints, look at the notes and the PowerPoints, and then you're all set. So I will see you soon.